Hi, everyone. I am Sadie Walters and the founder and executive director of Pitstop for the Birds, a nonprofit dedicated to restoring migratory bird stopover habitat by transforming required stormwater management systems into places where birds can safely rest and refuel on their long journeys. We focus especially on stormwater systems built into the human transportation infrastructure, places like EV charging stations, where people naturally spend downtime so that habitat restoration becomes a shared experience and an opportunity for broad public engagement. Today, I am thrilled to be in conversation with Dr. Freda Guo, whose work sheds light on the most vulnerable parts of a migratory bird's journey, migration, those twice annually harrowing journeys that carry birds thousands of miles so that they can raise their young where food is plentiful. Freda recently completed her PhD at Princeton and is now at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Her research uses weather radar and eBird data to map the invisible highways of migration, identify stopover hotspots, and understand how 30 years of land use change have reshaped where birds can safely land. Her work asks and answers the question at the heart of Pitstop for the Birds. Where are the places birds most need, and how can conservation meet them there? What I really love about Freda's research is how directly it connects science to action by revealing where migratory birds concentrate and showing how even fragmented green spaces can hold enormous ecological weight. She gives us all a roadmap for creating meaningful habitat at the scale that migration requires. So, Freda, I'm really thrilled to be in conversation with you today. And to start us off, I would love to hear what first drew you to stopover ecology and how you came to use radar as a powerful tool for revealing invisible highways of migration.
Yeah, thanks, Sadie, for the really kind introduction. I'm also super honored to be here and talk to you about my research and bird conservation in general. So yes, I got interested in stopover ecology because I'm always interested in migration. It all started like during undergrad when I first learned about the great migration of wildebeest in the Serengetis, and then I learned that birds also migrate, and in fact, like more than 70% of birds in North America are migratory. And so there's a recent study showing that a lot of birds, like the bird population, is in drastic decline. We've lost 3 billion of birds. Among them, 2.5 billion are migratory species. So they are in great trouble. And there have been a lot of conservation efforts to protect this species. So historically, it has been focusing on the breeding ground because we tend to think that those are the most important habitats where birds reproduce and raise their young. However, despite all these conservation efforts in the breeding ground, the bird population is still declining. So then people realize that a lot of the migratory species actually spend a lot of time in Central and South America for winter, and those regions tend to be very vulnerable to land use change. So there are growing efforts in the wintering ground as well. Nevertheless, the bird population is still declining. And what has been missing is this en route migration period where birds need to travel thousands of miles or kilometers every two times each year. And during this long distance journey, they're facing a lot of threats like habitat loss, predation, window collision, and all those. So it is very important to protect this en route habitat for them to successfully finish their migration journey, because there has been studies showing that migration period is actually the most dangerous phase, where the highest adult mortality occurs. So like most birds die during migration. And that's what got me interested in the stopover sites, because that's kind of like the life stage that's been the least studied, but also the most critical, because there's a saying that a chain is only as strong as its weakest link, and stopover sites are probably the weakest link that has been so understudied. So that's basically what got me interested in this.
That's great. That's great. And how does this radar,
Oh,
when
yeah.
you're using radar technology, and
Mhm.
how does that work? Will you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, usually whenever I said I used radar to study migration, to track migration, people would ask me, how do you tag them? How do you tag birds? Because that's people's general impression. Like if you want to study migration, you need to put a tag on birds, but not for radar. So like that's the most powerful thing about radar is that it basically detects any object in the air, just like how radar detect raindrops, because the radar that we use to study migration is weather radar. So we don't need to put any tags on birds, and we can detect all of them. Because essentially, all these radar stations will send out radio reflective signals to the surrounding airspace. And whenever it hits an object in the air, it could be raindrop or bird, they get reflected back and detected by radar. So from that signal, we can infer the amount of birds in the air and their flying speed. Also all these radar stations actively sample the airspace every 5 to 10 minutes continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So this provides an amazing tool to just monitor the massive population movements during migration in a very standardized and continuous way. So that's like the main power of radar.
And so with this radar, you're really
Mhm.
able to map out where these birds are traveling
Mhm.
on their migration. And then for revealing stopover
Right.
habitat, how do you
Mhm.
use radar to show where they're spending their stopovers?
Yeah, great question. So yes, so we use radar to detect how many birds are up in the air. So that's actually how platforms like Birdcast are built on. So I'm sure some of you have heard of that. And then for stopover mapping, it's a bit more like specific because we need to get the on-the-ground distribution of birds. Like we need to know where they took off from on the ground. And that's when the biology of a lot of migratory birds come into play, like a very handy role in that a lot of migratory songbirds are nocturnal migrants, meaning that they all take off at night near sunset in a very synchronized way. So when they took off from their stopover habitat in a mass like exodus, like the lift off, that can be captured by weather radar. So we basically just near sunset, we take a snapshot at the peak moment when most birds are lifting off. And then because we're just taking a snapshot right at the peak, where we can infer where they're taking off from because they haven't really dispersed that much. So that enables us to map their underground stopover distribution based on where they took off from.
Oh, that is so fascinating and such important information.
Mhm.
And what kinds of patterns are you finding revealing themselves as far as how these birds select for their stopover habitat? Are they selecting for specific sites over and over again? Are there vagrants that can you find vagrants with this radar? You know, the one-offs here and there, scattered, lost in a um, yeah, what kinds of patterns are you finding that are
Yeah,
revealing themselves as far as their selection, how they select their
right.
sites?
Yeah,
Yeah.
those are great questions. So the overall pattern we found is that, so because we focus on migratory songbirds, and there are billions of them, so we found that overall they move across a broad front, as many birders probably have like know that already. Like they tend to have this diffuse migration, meaning that they don't tend to follow like very strict flyways like waterfowl and shorebirds do, because for songbirds they can pretty much use any habitat with enough food. So any kind of forested habitat would work for them. So it's like more of a broad front. So if we compare the stopover distribution at a very broad scale across each state, we'll see that there are birds using their important stopover sites across all the states. But if we zoom in to the final spatial details, we do find a lot of stopover hotspots that large number of birds concentrate every year. So
Oh,
like So basically, at the broad scale, it's a broad front migration. But if we zoom into specific habitat like forest patches, we do see that there are hotspots that birds tend to use very consistently each year. And then back to your question about vagrants, that's one of the limitations about radar is that it cannot identify species. So we don't know we don't know which species are there, so we don't really know where they come from, where they should be. So it's a bit tricky to answer that question. But so radar is more suitable to answer broad scale questions because it's really monitoring the migration of billions of individuals migrating across the entire continent. So that's like the scale that radar really enables us to answer questions.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Mhm.
And then when birds are flying over really developed areas, like
Mm.
where I live is starting to be coined as the megalopolis. We've
Mhm.
got this Charlotte, Atlanta, Raleigh is just becoming a whole huge developed area. And when
Right.
birds are traveling over these big challenges, I know you've mentioned before, like the Corn Belt.
Mhm.
How do birds handle these major challenges in their migration?
Yeah,
Where do
yeah,
they
yes.
end up?
Yeah, great question. Yes, that's also one thing that I want to highlight a lot is that so Corn Belt, like you mentioned, in the Midwest, a lot of that landscape has been converted to agricultural fields, but there are
Mhm.
still remaining forest fragments. And we can see very clearly that those forest fragments are the most important habitat in that region, like the broadly deforested region, because birds have basically nowhere else to go other than to make use of the remaining habitat. And that pattern is so strong that you can even see that from raw radar images. You don't need to do any like further processing. You can just look at the radar image and you can see that birds are taking off from those forest strips, like the remaining forest strips in the Corn Belt. So that's one of the impacts of large-scale land use change is that it's really concentrating birds to the remaining forest fragments. But the other effects is that as the Corn Belt expands further, it's kind of like 500 to 800 kilometers in width. So in a way, it's kind of creating a migration barrier that is similar to the Gulf of Mexico and Sahara Desert because there's not enough stopover size within it. And to birds, it's just like sea of corn, and most of them don't really use it. So we also found that when birds are crossing the corn belt, they tend to fly faster, and they're also selecting for better tailwind support, which is like similar behaviors when birds are crossing the Gulf of Mexico. So this shows that the corn belt and the associated human activity, agricultural development, are altering migratory birds' behavior in a way that the Gulf, like natural barriers, are changing their behaviors.
Wow. Wow. And so these birds really need a good solid snack at the other side.
Exactly. So they do,
Yeah.
yes. So that's also one of the patterns, like a very strong pattern. If we analyze the stopover distribution right at the northern Gulf of the right at the northern coast of the Gulf, because if you
Hmm.
think about the direction of movement, the spring migrants they cross the Gulf. Like a lot of them need to fly nonstop for 30 or even longer, 30 hours or even longer to cross the more than 1,000 kilometers of open water. So they are exhausted. That's why you see that right by the coast, there are a lot of birds concentrating there just because they've completed this very long distance journey and they have to stop immediately. So we did not find as strong pattern after birds crossing the Corn Belt, probably because the Corn Belt compared to the Gulf is still a weaker barrier. It's not as wide, and more
Hmm.
importantly, there are still
Hmm.
forest fragments within the Corn Belt that birds, some of them, could use.
Hmm.
So it is
Hmm.
important to restore enough habitats, like after birds cross the barrier, But for the Corn Belt, because it's not open ocean, we can actually create a lot more stepping stones for them by restoring those important like forest fragments that a lot of them do use as stopover sites.
Yeah. And so these stopover sites, I also think about the role that urban parks play as
Mm-hmm.
stopovers. And,
Mm-hmm.
like New York City Central Park is famous for being an excellent birding site because it's the site that they can go to, surrounded by an ocean of developed area. They can go into the Central Park. And what role do you see? And you mentioned these forest fragments, and I'm wondering because Pitstop is builds these, restores tiny little microhabitats. And I'm just wondering what role you see these built microhabitats playing in creating that stepping stones for these birds
Mm-hmm.
to get to their destination. And do you see those smaller sites being this tiny fragmented sites being of value?
Yeah, definitely. That's why I'm super excited about this interview because I see a lot of synergy between what you're planning to do and also like my research. Because we focus a lot on like the small forest fragments that tend to get ignored in conservation planning. The reason is that
Mhm.
we used to think that for fragmented habitats are not so good. They are not good for breeding birds for sure because there's a lot of nest predation. The breeding success is very low, and that's why we traditionally like forest fragments are not good habitat. However, if we think
Mhm.
about stopover usage, birds are not as selective as when they're like selecting their breeding ground. They basically just need enough food to sustain their long distance migration. So they're a lot more flexible, and that's why they can tolerate or like they can actually make use of whatever is available, such as like the forest in the Corn Belt or Central Park in New York City. So actually forgot what your question is about. Can you repeat that?
Mm. The role that these small, like
Oh yeah.
built and constructed parks, and for Pitstop, it's
Mm-hmm.
retrofitting stormwater requirements,
Mm-hmm.
stormwater management requirements that might be adjacent to larger parcels or might be
Mm-hmm.
in a city.
Yeah.
So just wanting to touch on the role those tiny spaces play. And also, I'll add a little bit to that question of like, what
Mm-hmm.
kinds of cues are the birds looking out for when they select
Right.
for a stopover?
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, like the tiny forest fragments are definitely highlighted in our stopover hotspot map. But one of the limitations about radar is that even though it's like very fine scale, it probably like the smallest scale of each radar pixel like half a hectare. So it might be larger than like a lot of pit stop project. But I still think that no matter how small the size is, as long as it provides good habitat for birds, like good forest, have a good like tree for fruit trees for them to rest and refuel, it is important. Because one finding of our study is that so there are actually seasonal differences between those stopover hotspots. So in spring, they tend to favor deciduous trees more, possibly because for spring migrants, they feed a lot on the caterpillars, and caterpillars like juicy leaves on broadleaf trees. On the other hand, during fall
Mhm.
migration, they are they have a broader diet. So during fall migration, a lot of birds actually shift their diets from insects to fruits because there's just like
Mhm.
less insects available and there are more fruits. And they like we do see a stronger like an increased use of evergreen forests, for example, because in spring
Mhm.
there isn't a lot of caterpillars on those evergreen trees, but in fall there are definitely like some fruits and of other foods available like seeds they can use. So like planting enough fruiting trees or other food that birds can make use of definitely will help with their migration journey.
Mhm. 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 Um, so that gets me to thinking about like what what stopover, like designing stopover habitats might prioritize for these fruiting trees,
And
and
shrubs.
also and shrubs. So
Mhm.
fruit that will provide the fats and the sugars that the birds
Mhm.
need, and then also the ones that are the host to those protein-rich
Yeah,
caterpillars.
yeah,
Yummy.
exactly. Birds think so too.
And that they're different in the spring and fall. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mhm.
Um, so when in this, now I'm going to get a little bit personal, but not
Right.
too personal. So when you look at when we think about where we're at with birds, we got this hard news in 2019 that
Mm.
we'd lost 30% of them.
Mhm.
And that's really, I mean, they are this canary in the coal mine that's letting us know that there's some major environmental issues going on. And they also seem to respond to help, and we can track them. I mean, it's just incredible that this radar, we can through work like yours learn so much about where the birds are going and what they
Mhm.
need. Um, and I feel so much hope in knowing that there's that kind of research out there that will inform conservation
Mhm.
groups like my own, and how to support these birds through these
Right.
journeys. And I just wonder for you, in your role of doing this research, what do you find hope in? Like what makes you feel hopeful about the future of birds? Or do you have hope?
Yeah, yeah, I do. I do have hope. I
That's,
have
yeah,
hope.
spacing it on you has hope. Yeah.
Yeah, the hope comes from both the research and also the public engagement side, because I feel like there's a
Mm,
lot more and more important um, research with great conservation implications with the development of technology and also brilliant research ideas. And also, I see so much enthusiasm from the general public about protecting birds. So I feel like people want
mm,
to protect them. It's just like
mhm.
historically we don't know how. We lack the tools. We don't know, for example, for songbirds, for migratory songbirds, because they're such like migrating a diffuse in a broad front way, we don't really know where to start. They are pretty much
Oh.
everywhere, right? So I think that's the power. That's when like researchers come to play. Is that we do need to help those conservation practitioners to highlight the important stopover sites or other habitat that they should focus on, like as the starting point. And that's what we are doing, like researchers from the Lab of O, Cornell Lab of O, and also national-wide. We are using radar data, we are using eBird data to discover all this important habitat that birds need to use. And we are working with conservation agencies. For example, I'm currently collaborating with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service on a new conservation framework focusing on the eastern deciduous forest. And that is like a landscape-based conservation framework to just specifically focusing on habitat protection and restoration on private land. Because one thing that we
Mm.
found from our previous research is that a lot of the hotspots that we identified are not protected. So only like about less than 1/3 of them are within protected areas. The most are in unprotected private land. So that really highlights the necessity to engage with private landowners. So like this conservation framework I was mentioning with the USDA really provides this opportunity to connect like research with private landowners on protecting these stopover habitats. And also the other hope, like I mentioned, from public enthusiasm, because I feel like whenever I talk to general public about my research, they always respond with so much enthusiasm and
Mm.
passion. Like there are a few times when I was just giving speech about the same study, like oh, stopover size, the forest fragments are important. The corn belt is a migration barrier, and then like I actually met with quite a few landowners in the Midwest, and they were saying that how can I do to help these birds? I have these small land patches that I don't really like. I like to make it bird friendly. How can I do? How can I protect them? And I feel like this
Mm.
individual based conservation can also make a difference as long as they're passionate, as long as they have the right information. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I just feel like there needs to be, we need to build better bridge between the research side and also the conservation practitioner side and private landowner side. Because ultimately, we
Hmm.
have the same goal. We want to save the birds, and we can contribute in different ways.
Oh my gosh, that's so beautiful.
Mhm.
Wow, thank you. Well, is there anything else that you might want to bring up? I'm going to wrap up our interview here in a moment, but is there anything else that's kind of hanging out in the sides of your mind that you might want to share?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we pretty much covered all of them. So
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
those are very good questions.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much, Frida. Your
Mhm.
work is really fascinating, and I'm just so grateful that you're out there helping us understand how to restore and help birds, restore stopover habitat and help birds through their migration. And really grateful that your work, I mean, your work will help guide Pitstop. So thank you for your work.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me here.
Yeah. All right. See you next time.
All right, see ya.